It's true that the orientation of Christian self-awareness comes through the dignity of Christ embodied within us, because we're brothers and sisters in the Christ, who the Christ, for example, St. Paul, is the blueprint of a human being fully evolved. There won't be any surpassing that evolution in human awareness and goodness and all that. The Christ is the apex of what it means to be fully human and fully alive, according to St. Ignatius of Antioch, and that's the glory of God. However, we always have to put a check by that how do we come to know that? We come to know that also through the mediation of other people who've had that experience. Collectively in faith community, they begin to mediate because God seems to always choose mediation as the preferred way to approach a human person.
Hi guys, welcome back. New face here, but with our honorable guest, Father Daniel. And I realized that I really wanted to do this with you because there are certain approaches and ways that you view things about modern day that I find very interesting and that I feel connected in a way. Oh. So in particular about culture, modern day culture, specifically media and storytelling. Mm-hmm. You and I were talking briefly at some point about storytelling in movies, and mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of movies, and I think I might overthink about them, but I do think that there's something underlying in most of these stories that is not just for entertainment's sake, but there's some sort of spiritual truth that comes out of them, and we recognize them at a subconscious level. And I think become beacons of lights that allow us to kind of shape our understanding of how to approach life, or a little understanding about existence in general. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, as I think previously remarked, Andrew was what we're experiencing, I think, archetypically is something very primordial in human consciousness right now in the global village. In times past, in early antiquity of humanity, gathering around a fire, an illuminative spot at the night, with the shamans and tribes and so forth and elders telling mythological stories or stories about demons, gods, or social issues between one tribe and another, long past wars. There was kind of a review going on, and yet the shape of each tribal culture, and probably this goes back to even pre-tribal, the human race seems to have this penchant to gather and to tell stories with meaning and with different mythological and ethical kind of ways of reinforcing, say, a particular, what we would call today, an ideology or a theology. Mm-hmm. I think in contemporary world, what we're doing now, because of our technologies and the advancement of storytelling has taken on through motion pictures for the last 100 years. It's not that people aren't still gathering and telling stories among their families and friends around a barbecue pit or whatever, but now the penchant is to gather around an electronic campfire, which is either your in-home entertainment center or in a theater. Mm-hmm. and the interaction with light, illumination, along with the storytelling of a particular screenwriter or novelist, that's our a director or producer's interpretation of that, becomes something people find intriguing, but also I think it still is playing that role of allowing them to explore sometimes their own questions or answers they believe they've arrived at about life or about relationships or about humor. You can go on and different things.
You're reminding me a lot of one of my not literary heroes, but I guess thinkers, Joseph Campbell.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So he's kind of a hero of mine because he at least reflected some of those curiosities that I had, like something's there. And then he kind of reaffirmed it or made me think that, okay, I'm on the right path, but there's probably a lot that I still need to know. But back to the whole storytelling and gathering around the campfire, I think at the very least within tribes, there is that gathering of the tribe where someone in particularly special kind of assigned or kind of fit the role of a wise man or a shaman, as you said, that told the whole story in the village, and everyone's kind of in communion with that story and kind of all relating in that way. And the Greeks, having their poetry set on stage and acted on stage, it in a way it was both entertainment and political at the same time. And how the town, those cities in Greece, that was the way that people understood each other or knew what they all believed in together politically and in religious for religious matters. And then you think of the 20th century, going to cinema and everyone gathering at an assembly, very much like a church, like you'll go through halls and everyone's quiet when they should. The story tells you how to react, when to laugh, when to scream. And there's something amazing about being with people and kind of all experiencing that same emotion and knowing that you're not the only one, but it's shared amongst everyone. There's a sense of belonging. So I am, for one, in modern days, now the 21st century, I am a little split about that because I love the fact that more people are telling stories, but because more people are maybe not because, but the technology has allowed us to have TV at home, or essentially cinema at home. So it's becoming smaller and smaller, less community, more family. Family's great, but then all of a sudden there's also devices in every room, and now everyone, but now in the palm of your hand. So we're all kind of more disconnected and going through our own personal journey with the screen, but it's no longer shared. And then there's an aspect of having to, there's something about, going through Netflix or going through Hulu or going through Disney Plus and choosing your own story to watch rather than kind of with everyone choosing something to go with. And I think I feel like there's a parallel there with congregations getting smaller and smaller, and also cinema getting smaller and smaller. There's kind of this, perhaps I would say there's I kind of want to relate this to metaphysics, but there's some metaphysical introduction to something that technology brought that no longer makes us feel that we need to be in community. So I'm wondering if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was at an auto repair shop, and there was a boy there who was the son of the owner, and he was probably about fifth grade, and he was sitting at the counter and kind of interacting somewhat with the cashier and a few other men who came in, and then all of a sudden, I was sitting across from him, just waiting, and he came over and sat down beside me. Didn't say anything. He was a very quiet boy. And it was almost as if he needed to be, I guess, present where someone wasn't going to disturb him, but he felt safe. So he's finishing his mathematical homework, and then finally, in his knapsack or backpack, he pulls out a screen, small screen, and starts watching these different cartoon favorites of his while he's waiting for his dad to sign off from work, Mm-hmm. And it was exactly what you say. He was watching this storytelling experience, but couldn't interact beyond that. At least he had something to interact with. In a big world of noise and all these things that were going on. So it is interesting that he was carrying that off until his father came on and said, "Let's go home." Mm-hmm. But it's exactly a paradigm of what you're talking about, that this is it's becoming, from a church point of view, Pope Paul VI, many years ago after the Vatican Council, he made a interesting insight saying that it was in response to a lot of the philosophers at the time, which were beginning to stir about this individualism phenomena, and he said, well, the church is an incarnate religion, and it's defined by the incarnate relationship of Jesus in family, in communities, and so forth. And so the church can't afford to retreat away into an individualism, which is the opposite of individuation, and that we have to, otherwise we risk the message of the gospel and of church life becoming so cerebralized and so abstract that it just reinforces this idea that I can interpret it in such a way as to meet only my need, or what I think my needs are, away from the communal accountability and exchange of relationships. And that this is a very critical time. We're seeing the fruit of it more and more, I think. You have I think in the society, you have this titanic pull going that people want to find communities of relationships. They seem to be moving more towards ideological positions to gather together, but then that once they've been there, then they go back home to this extreme individual mode. And basically they want some kind of, I would say, a bigoted response to make them comfortable with their own biases. Mm-hmm. And so just in the political scheme alone, but this is also happening in religious schematics as well, to where instead of, like Pope Francis has been saying, we cannot argue on the basis of ideological positions. Mm-hmm. We have to be listeners to one another, walk with one another, and discuss and exchange in community what really is impacting us all. Mm-hmm. The climate change, there's all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's this frustration that I have of today where everything is, it's made me highly skeptical of everything, and it's made me kind of hold back on what to say, because whatever it is I say, I hate that it has to be in the context of some sort of a political what do you call it, dichotomy, mm-hmm. Like it's got to be either the black or the white, and it's such there's in psychology there's the borderline personality disorder, mm-hmm. Where that's the reason why it's a behavioral disorder is because they tend to be surrounded by this sort of way of thinking, which is everything's borderline, and it's either here or there, and so there seems to be a behavioral disorder of going highly happy or extremely sad. And what's funny is that symptom is now at a societal level, mm-hmm. where everything's politicized. Like I remember there was there were I'm not picking sides at all, but I'm making the observation that little things have become, politicized, where if you're talking about Christianity, all of a sudden you're highly conservative or something, like, where that's not at all the case. And then at the same time, in I remember talking about, I maybe my cousin wore a mask because he was sick, and all of a sudden people were saying all that, and then we're no longer. This was after the whole pandemic thing kind of was coming to a conclusion. I know there's still viruses here and there, but like, he was sick, so he didn't want to contaminate. But people were thinking like, oh, he's this high liberal person that now is can't help but be with a mask. It's like, no, that person's sick,
Mm-hmm.
Or if I talk about, I'm trying to think of something, like, I think there was a drug that got highly politicized during the pandemic, where it's like, it used to be over the counter thing that has been used for like almost 100 years. And all of a sudden, when the pandemic hit, if you were using it, you're all of a sudden on either the right or the left. Like, why are you using that? No, go with the vaccines. Like, well, come on, like, it's a drug. Like, why does it have to be political?
Mm-hmm.
And so everything is, so it's gotten me to a point where I'm frustrated of trying to say anything without people putting it in their own context. There's the movie Rashomon, the Japanese movie. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't.
Well, they call it have you heard of the Rashomon effect?
Mm-hmm.
Well, essentially it's a court case in Japan where there's someone murdered, and everyone has to tell the account, everyone that witnessed it, and every single witness changed the story to benefit their view, and so they had to change it for the sake of their ego. And so I feel like that's somewhat the case here. When you say something, people will grab it and make something of it for their own ego or for their own way of thinking. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So where was I going with this? Oh, well, like, I suppose I'm trying to make a connection between this kind of state of what the society's at, and how perhaps as a church, how we can be a beacon, specifically about the Camaldolese monks and what they can offer in this sense.
Yeah, monasticism, at least our tradition for 1,000 years, replicating in some ways the Acts of the Apostles, which is what monastic life is actually founded on, where we share all in common, like the early church did. But we tell the story of Jesus. Mm-hmm. We keep alive the story of the gospel and the accounts of Jesus's interaction in his public ministry and his death and resurrection, so forth. And what it is, we're gathering, and then in the early church, as well as in early monasticism, and even still today, we keep with an hour devoted in the morning to what we call the vigil. And the vigil is a reflection on praying 2 sets of psalms from the Old Testament, and then reflecting on 2 extensive readings. Usually with our tradition, we take one book of the Bible, say if we were taking the letter of Philippians, for example, and we will read that contiguously until we've read the whole thing for the next, say, month or a couple of months. Mm-hmm. But and then also we would take various readings from both Protestant and Catholic in this present context, or even some from the Dalai Lama and other wisdom teachers, both contemporary and in the past, to that might reflect or mirror in some way the essential truths that seem to be coming through, sometimes to contrast too, so that we maintain a spirit of listening primarily to the story of the human race's interaction with the divine experience thus far they've encountered, and sometimes it's recorded in what we call written tradition, both in our own Christian journey or the three major Abrahamic faiths, the monotheistic faiths, and so forth.
Now, a lot of these practices, are they unique to your order?
No, generally monasticism in the West and the Eastern churches among the Christian form of monasticism would have vigils as part of their process. Now, we add within our context what we call a time where we spend an hour as a community with the scriptures, say, coming for Sunday, or another major feast like the Feast of St. Luke or something. And we will have what they call in Italian a collatio. And what that means, we collect together and we read the reading about 2 or 3 times. And then the person who's facilitating this will ask the group of monks and maybe lay people who might be there, is there a particular word from that passage or phrase that struck you? Believing that as we've gathered to hear the word together, that the Lord will reveal something that we need to understand about a person's approach to that scripture, and then have a discussion, but not an argument. Basically, it's not a venue to argue theological points, but to express impressions, and then to pray over that, and hopefully the idea that the preachers for the coming feast or whatever would gain some insights that would inform their prayer and their reflection on the scripture and their study of it, to see what the Lord might be speaking through that local situation. The collatios, for example, that we have at our monastery in Rome, for example, at San Gregorio or St. Gregory the Great, which is our monastery, there is as many as 600 or 700 people that come on a Wednesday night just to listen to the scriptures, and they have microphones set up, and they spend like 3 hours. And these are people who are coming in after work. And I mean, young and old, teenagers, and they get up and they share this as is facilitated by the monks, just as an example.
So this is still going on. That's beautiful. That's
yeah,
really beautiful.
It's, of course, it gets to the point earlier when we were talking about the difference between what's happening to collective ways of communication and relationship. It pulls people back together to collectively relate around the Prince of Peace. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that points of view and ideas, wherever they may be coming from in a person's consciousness or reaction, are okay to have out there, but they don't become a bully pulpit for ideological positions and so forth. The important thing is to give people a chance to speak and also to be listened to. And at the collatio, at the end of it, then the word to collect, the collect from the Mass, is to bring that together in prayer, trusting that what do I take away from this that involves me in other people's lives who have shared something of a more intimate nature out of their understanding and expose themselves even publicly, but they are not to be ridiculed for that.
Right.
So you can have a gay person in that experience speaking from a paradigm of their experience of maybe being constrained into an atmospherics of aloneness that is not good for them, but it gives them a range to say something without being threatened that someone's going to throw them out the door just because their sexual preference was there, expressed about how they reacted to the text. Because a good facilitator of the gospel would say, well, Jesus ate and drank with the downtrodden and the people who were the outcasts. That's what got him in trouble. And actually took him to the cross, so he broke the taboos of the time, interacting with women, prostitutes, all this sort of stuff. And who knows how many different people. But the important thing is that can we not do the same, where there is a hospitality of God present towards anyone, depending on what kind of context we could offer in our imperfections ourselves. A lot of times in those contexts, a lot of the woundedness that we ourselves have experienced, we may not have the same woundedness as another, or the same rejections or whatever. But if we look into our own conscience, we can say, who was it that aided me? How did God mediate to me through other people how to surmount that, so that I could be a greater measure of what it really means to be a fully grown human being in the light of the revelation of the Christ.
You were making this distinction between individuality and individuation.
Yeah.
And you're saying this. I'm slowly more and more realizing that the whole premise to the Second Vatican Council was a humanism, like a humanistic one, which is focusing on the human. Now, was the church approaching it through individuality, like individuation? Okay.
Yeah.
What is exactly the difference?
Well, the difference would be like, in borrowing from Dr. Carl Jung, individuation is where a person in their human maturity, spiritually, psychologically, and physically, come to whatever level of maturation that their giftedness, their personality, and their human development will allow in the context of a social network that nurtures and also empowers them to self-realization and whatever gifts they may have. Individualism is a philosophical structure that says it's basically, I describe it as like being the constant narcissist, where the narcissism overtakes my way of relating to people, and it's a take no prisoners approach. It's sort of like when you have your children and they go through the terrible twos. It's like getting stuck into the terrible twos all your life.
Yeah, there's
and there's no maturity. You may physically mature. You may psychologically become well-educated and everything. But if it's stuck on pure individualism, then you have lots of problems that begin to happen in the matrix of society that cause great disruption. One of the critical problems, I think, that happened with the sex scandal in the church. You had very brilliant people, for example, who, from an academic point of view, were just stellar, right? Mm-hmm. But from a social, relational balance in their life that hadn't happened. They were still entrapped in whatever level of their adolescence or whatever, and of course it caused havoc.
Yeah,
although it's only 1% of the population of the ordained, but that all got inflated, to the fact that every clergy person is consigned now to be behind that curtain and that veil. But that would be, say, a sociological and psychological situation where individuation was not attended to properly. And so you can have a person who develops these aberrant behaviors in their life and they become divorced from real reality, because if you're narcissistically involved, all you're looking for is how I can satisfy the pleasure principle or whatever it is in myself to the harm or exclusion of others.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think I was trying to study, that phenomenon of like people we trust kind of abuse in a position of power that abuse the vulnerable. And I know that it wasn't just in the church; it was kind of widespread, kind of all around in schools and probably Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, or it just so happens that in the church it's structured in a way where you can sue primarily through one source, where the other nonprofits are a little kind of rough to actually try to repair damages. But it was definitely widespread, and also during those same times, it was also the rise of, the term psychopath came about, through. There was kind of an urban term, but when it became a clinical term, that's when it arose. I think Robert Hare. I think Dr. Robert Hare, the one leading the whole literature on psychopathy, and the detriment. Not that psychopaths never existed, and not that all of them are bad. The spectrum and the level it's always kind of there's intricate aspects to that personality, but when it came about where more and more crimes were done, not necessarily out of a political sense, but more out of a self-indulgence of committing these crimes. It was kind of like around the same time, which only makes me think back to the whole stories and how as a society we become more individualized rather than I'm sorry, I can't tell the term, but I remember listening to a missionary from Colombia, and he said something that struck me. From a psychological standpoint, perhaps it's incorrect, and he kind of mentioned it too. That he said, it said something like this. I'm probably gonna butcher it, but he said something like, self-esteem is not proper for a Christian, and he doesn't necessarily. And he even said it like, yes, self-esteem is true. People need it for self-worth, especially those who are in the world, but for Christians it should be something else, and he called it Christ esteem. He's like, it should be, our worth is not one that's self-given. Like you're not the one in control. Your self-esteem should come from Christ. You're worth something because God believes in you, and he gives you a purpose, and it's that kind of surrendering to him and learning who you are through him and this constant conversation, and that's where your worth comes from. And it struck me because it gave me a new perspective of no longer dividing myself against people, but it's more like making myself small as much as I can so I could hear his voice better, and it allows me to be open to other people. I guess you reminded me of those things. We are at 30 minutes. I promised you there would be only 30 minutes. Well, but is there something that you'd like to add?
Well, I was just saying, he's correct. I would say my own critique of that statement by the fellow from Colombia. It's true that the orientation of Christian self-awareness comes through the dignity of Christ embodied within us, because we're brothers and sisters in the Christ, the Christ, for example, St. Paul, is the blueprint of a human being fully evolved. There won't be any surpassing that evolution in human awareness and goodness and all that. The Christ is the apex of what it means to be fully human and fully alive, according to St. Ignatius of Antioch, and that's the glory of God. However, we always have to put a check by that how do we come to know that? We come to know that also through the mediation of other people who've had that experience. Collectively in faith community, they begin to mediate because God seems to always choose mediation as the preferred way to approach a human person. Most of the mystical tradition is not something that is developed out of, again, an individualism, but an individuation process where the relationships in that particular saint's life or sainted community is mediated the grace of this understanding to some degree or another, or sometimes the disparity that may be there that also pushes the envelope for a person to open themselves more deeply, either through repentance or through self-donation and charity. Like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, the great saint of our time, said, God did not call me to be successful. He called me to be faithful. But when you have to look back through the anthropology of her development as a human person to understand how she finally matured to that. She didn't start out that way. She went through a whole maturation and a different religious order and everything before she got to the point where she ended up founding the Daughters of Charity in India. And it's like when you take a recent canonization of St. Charles de Foucauld, who was killed by Muslims in Algeria, and he was a French foreign legionary and was actually not an atheist, but he was a person who had become pretty much agnostic and a man of the world of his time. And he goes there and he has this amazing conversion experience and becomes like a desert father, a hermit, and befriends the Muslim and Islamic communities and everything, and lives in incredible ascetic life, and yet gave everything to the poor and helping them. He really separated himself from the French colonialists, of his time, but he ends up being martyred too, by the very people that he was serving in some way. It's the same way with the Trappist monks. Just about 10 years ago or so in Africa, the entire community was martyred. And so the question was, are the Trappists going to leave out, North Africa because of that? And so anyway, the general of the Trappist order asked, would there be any volunteers willing to go back? And sure enough, there were a number of monks who volunteered and went back to that very monastery where all those men had been martyred. They did a motion picture on it.
Is that what that? I was about to say there's a movie very similar to that, but it's not in the same setting, is it?
Yeah, it's in the same setting. And matter of fact, it was a docu-movie that they did on that.
Oh, so I'm thinking of a different movie. What movie are you referring to?
The title of it is Gods
of Men?
Gods of Men, yeah.
Oh, it is the same one. Oh, yeah, they were giving certain stats. That was a beautiful movie.
That was
very human, very
authentic experience of those monks. But it shows you that they kept the story going as a community. See, the story of the Trappists among, just like Charles de Foucauld and now what is called the Little Brothers of Jesus are the order that he founded, and the Little Sisters of Jesus. And they live anonymously among people. Like you could be working in a factory in a sweatshop in Chicago, and you might be working right next door to, the person standing next to you could be a little sister of Jesus or a little brother of Jesus. And their belief is the mustard seed principle, that they're living a life, they're putting something into the world wherever it is, but again, their self-esteem is inwardly directed by what they experience through St. Charles de Foucault's charism and the community, and then the development to give their life away in radical simplicity. And as a matter of fact, Pope Francis chose a brother from the Little Brothers of Jesus to head the seminary in Rome.
Wow.
As the rector.
Yeah. Well, there's something about, sorry, I'm kind of switching gears a little bit just to help conclude this, but there's something really beautiful about seeing an order that is so dependent on fraternity and being with your brethren and being in this together and contemplating together and living a simple life that perhaps, I guess I would compare it to my grandmother who whenever I'd visit her, may she rest in peace, whenever I visit her, she was quiet. And it almost seems like we ignored her, but and she would never talk. But after she passed away, we realized her absence and her effect and her love, how much we depended on that love, and how once she was gone, we realized how much impact she was giving to us with just silence and just doing her chores, being there and loving us without having the need of our attention. Yeah. That was beautiful. And so I feel like, in order, like the Camaldolese monks, like you guys selves, and or even like in Big Sur, it's just this fraternity that is just that is just there, and in their own presence, they bring something to the community, whether we notice it.
Yeah, and that's what happens as a result of sacred silence, as opposed to the silent treatment that a lot of people. But sacred silence is involved in an interaction of intimacy between what God can communicate beyond voice and to the human heart and the spirit. And at the same time, it's a learning of a language of the heart that one evolves in, that you really become more understanding of how much you are really a part of one another. And so just as the heart has 4 chambers in it, for example, if one chamber is suffering or weakened and everything, well, the heart tries to compensate for the whole thing until you got to get a pacemaker or whatever. But for us, it's what we call the privilege of love, is what the hallmark of the calling that we have to grow into. It's not a ready-made process for us in the conversion of life, which we vow ourselves to. It means, well, it's a lifelong journey that we're going to make with the support and prayer of others, and our lending of our support and what we've garnered from God's intuitions and displays of providence in our lives, what great and small, But the listening allows you to focus on the little, because in the potential of the little is the grandeur of what changes. And I think that follows very much what they're discovering in subatomic physics and also in biology. All the levels of the sciences are looking into the smaller aspects of what triggers things. I was talking to a botanist not long ago, and he was talking about the amazing amount of stuff he's been discovering just in a patch of earth around certain plant life, all the different ingredients of molds and fungi and everything else that's always interacting, that it's a whole ecosystem just in a 12-inch by 12-inch plot of land that both restores, nurtures, and guides that particular experience. But it was interesting meditation because he spent an entire research project just on that and wrote a doctorate.
That's beautiful that you say that, because I've been talking to one of my friends who's not, I guess he's Catholic in name, Christian in name, but not, he's not. He's kept a distance from it, and so part of me, he has a lot of doubts and everything, and I told him the only way I know how to talk in terms of spirituality, and it's talking about existence itself. Like, is there at the groundest level, at the deepest level that we could think of, is the nature of existence a loving one or not? And I think when you're really listening, when you really pay attention, even to the smallest things that doesn't necessarily have to shout out, but even if it's in its own silence, it shouts out that it loves you. Like there's something regenerative about seeing Earth this complex and helping itself, and for there's that cycle of death and life, but with the suffering and happiness. But like by and large, it's one that loves. And so, and if so, if something loves it, something has to love. Mm-hmm. And so that's where you could start to think about nature that way, rather than always thinking in a very pessimistic way where it's like life is just here to make us suffer and we're just in it to like go through bad times. Like, I don't think that's true. If you really pay attention to all those little things.
Yeah, and there's so much of Christianity, unfortunately, that's fallen prey to that very kind of ideological thinking that Christ just, you leave it at the door of suffering as almost to the point where it's just such a total impasse that nothing else is ever you can look for from God. So why be a Christian? Rather than looking at Jesus' behavior, he never, in his teaching, ever to ascribe salvation through that the Father desired, suffering.
Right.
He did make the idea that you might have to suffer in this world for the sake of my name, but that was for the sake of the goodness, but that's not the intention of why God came. In the flesh, it was to affirm and also to build up the covenant of love that was being revealed, and also to crown creation from what in the beginning God had always wanted. The Franciscan theology under Duns Scotus caught it really well, and the church bought that at the Lateran Council many centuries ago, that Adam and Eve's fall was not the end of the story, and that what really was the intention of God all along was to reveal the Christ risen, because although they were immortal, they still didn't know resurrection. And resurrection is a whole different venue, of what it means to live in full communion with God. And so we kind of misstepped on our theology, for a long time. And there's the idea that death and all these things were, that God had to come in and rescue us, from something, a failed plan. But it really wasn't that. We were the ones who retreated. It wasn't God. God always had the intention of bringing about the fullness of what that would mean. And that would illuminate the whole idea of what really Eden, the new creation, is.
Right. That, it's beautiful that you bring up Genesis, because I've been looking at Genesis more and more. The more I read it, the more I love it, the more complex and very beautiful that text is. And it's not as straightforward as people make it out to be.
Yeah.
And this kind of, the more and more I read it, the more I'm emotional about it, because there's this sense of God's love to us to like bring us all together, like he's on a mission, and not necessarily, his plan is a mystery, but it just kind of opens up that aspect of him that's just not as straightforward as we try to make him out to be. And I don't like, I guess that's reflective of today. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping here, but I feel like society has made him out to be this sort of anti-human type of God, which is like anyone who subscribes to him becomes that sort of antisocial. And he's quite the contrary. Once we make him that, it's easy to dispense of him, get rid of God out of the picture. But which I guess is what Nietzsche was trying to do, or how he perceived it, right? He saw that we saw him that way, therefore once we made him that, we killed him. So once we make God that way, where he's just an imposition that's anti-us, once we boxed him in like that, it's easy to kill him, which he's clearly not that.
Oh, yeah. It was like if you read in the brothers Karamazov from the Russian tradition, the Grand Inquisitor scene is very powerful, because Christ returns, but he's in the line with the rest of the poor
the cardinal
proletariat that's out there. And the cardinal, of all people, finds him an enemy to everything that they were about. And so he's going to have him put to death again. It's that same scenario they played out with Pilate and Jesus. Pilate had lost all faith in any kind of gods, for that matter. He only knew the power and authority of the emperor and the cause of Rome, as his only, that's where he got his paycheck and his fame. But anything that disturbed that, there was no holds barred for that. So he, even Jesus gives him the invitation to realize who he is and who's for Pilate as a human being, and saying, the one who hears my voice hears the truth. And then Pilate's own response is, what is truth? Mm-hmm. Rather than who is truth.
Right.
And of course, that's where it ended. And he disposed of him, thinking that he could put him out of the universe. But of course, that didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I promised you to be under 45. So I think now's the time. I think that's a perfect place to catch up on the next talk if you're open to it.
Sure.
Anyways, beautiful talk. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sam. Blessings on you and Andrew.